Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Anthony Finkelstein. I'm the new president of City University of London, and it's my privilege to chair this evening's 8th Sir Roger Jowell Memorial Lecture. I would eschew the complicated notes that have been provided me by preparation, but on this particular occasion they are so good that I'm going to rely upon them significantly to say what follows. So the first a few bits of house order. I will say a few words. The lecture will proceed. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. That opportunity to ask questions will be managed through the Mentimeter tool, and you will have the code for Mentimeter and the web address in front of you. For those of you in the lecture theatre here, the Wi-Fi code for the week is on the slide in front of you. This lecture is a memorial to Sir Roger Jowell, and a man of outstanding distinction and whose personal character has made a mark on all of those who worked with him and many beyond that. It was really interesting when I was given the brief. It includes extracts from a set of the obituaries, and they're so sharply framed that I think they're worthy of repetition. So, thanks to Roger Jowell, co-founder of NatCen, the National Centre for Social Research, we are potentially a deeply self-knowing society. His studies of British attitudes over time and in comparison with other European countries amassed a trove of social knowledge, high standards in fieldwork and intellectual precision in the methods of finding out what we think. Jowell's hallmarks have given the UK an international reputation for the quality of this field of sociological inquiry. I very much like the turn of phrase, that deeply self-knowing, which surely is a high praise for a scholar. At City, Roger will be remembered for his dedication to rigorous research methodologies, as well as his irreverence, his lack of pomposity, and his kindness, all qualities admired by his students and by his colleagues, who also saw him as a distinguished researcher and leader. He is greatly missed by colleagues and students alike. And finally, the Telegraph. Jowell was amongst the first social statisticians to recognize the value of qualitative research to divine not only the what, but the why of how people think as they do. So, I will now take an opportunity to introduce this evening's speaker, Paul Johnson. Paul has been the director of the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, since January 2013, and he's also currently visiting professor in the Department of Economics at UCL. Paul has worked and published extensively on the economics of public policy, with a particular focus on income distribution, public finances, pension, tax, social security, education, and climate change, so a broad remit. He was awarded a CBE for services to the social sciences and economics in 2018. As well as a previous period of work at IFS, his career has included spells at HM Treasury, for which we forgive him, the Department for Education and the FSA. Between 2004 and 2007, He was deputy head of the Government Economic Service. Paul is currently also a member of the Committee on Climate Change and the Banking Standards Board. He was an editor of the minorities review of the UK tax system. His lecture this evening will examine the challenges for policy created by inequalities in education and wealth and between the regions, ethnic minorities and generations that have been so affected by the coronavirus pandemic. So this evening's 8th Sir Roger Jowell lecturer, your podium.
Now, how do I get this to go? Well, if someone could come and sort this out while I extemporize, that would be good. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you so much for the invitation to particularly to give the Roger Jowell lecture. I was fortunate to know Roger, not desperately well, but for a period of time, and it really is a huge honour to be giving this lecture. And I know that whilst his widow Sharon isn't here in person this evening, I understand that she's watching online. So Sharon, thank you so much. I'm probably going to try and do too much this evening. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the challenges facing government, in particular as a result of inequalities post-COVID. And to give the sort of game away, to start with, for me, not going to be too miserable, in the sense that I don't actually think, in most areas, things have got an enormous amount worse. That's not what I thought 6 or 9 months ago, but I think I'm going to, hopefully, across most areas, though not all, provide some evidence that essentially we're facing the same kind of problems as we were facing 2 years ago, which is not great news, but it could be worse. I'm going to draw on a whole lot of research that colleagues of mine have been doing at the IFS over the last, mostly over the last 18 months or so. And I'm not going to acknowledge all of them by name, but you should know that this is the work of my colleagues much more than it is mine. Let's start with the sort of chart, as director of the IFS, I always have to show, which is something about the fiscal situation. These are these are lines showing the amount of borrowing, the green one that the Office of Budget Responsibility expected when it reported just before the pandemic in March 2020, and the blue line you can see shooting up to a peacetime record of borrowing. There was no year outside of the First and Second World Wars in which the UK has borrowed that much. But you can see it falling back really quite quickly to levels not much above pre-pandemic projections. Now that OBR forecast was based on Treasury numbers assuming a very, very tight set of spending controls, and we will find out towards the end of October actually how tight that spending's going to be. But I think the message of this, and this may even look a bit better now because the economy's taken off even better, I think, than expected, that the borrowing challenge is not a great deal bigger than it was pre-pandemic. The debt challenge is more, again, from the OBR back in March 2020 and March 2021. We've now got debt staying up towards 100% of national income. Now, you'll recall that prior to the financial crisis, the limit was supposed to be 40% of national income. That ratcheted up, as you can see, to over 70% pre-pandemic, ratcheting up again towards 100%. How much of a worry this is, I genuinely don't know. In actually an exceptionally good publication earlier this summer, the OBR's Fiscal Risks report went through all of the things that you can do to prepare for the sorts of risks that we've just faced, pandemics, financial crises, Brexit, what have you. And their conclusion at the end was the best thing you can do to prepare for these risks is have some fiscal headroom to deal with them when they arrive, because we don't know what the next problem's going to be. It won't be a pandemic, probably. It won't be another banking crisis. It'll be something else. And being prepared for everything is not something I think governments can do. But having some fiscal headroom is probably quite important. So that higher level of debt may be, but may not be, a problem. But the bigger picture here is that without tax rises or spending cuts across the rest of public expenditure, that debt will move up eventually exponentially because of the costs of aging. More money for health, more money for pensions, more money for social care. And again, relative to those long-term costs, what we've seen over the last year and a half is perhaps arguably not so huge. But what we have seen, what's the government's response to this? I'm not going to talk about the government's response over the last 18 months in terms of furlough and all of the other things that it's done. It's clearly spent vast amounts of money. And the reason that borrowing went up is that increase in spending. Normally in recessions, and we had the deepest recession since probably the early 1700s last year, normally in recessions, you get big increases in borrowing because tax revenues go down. Last year, that didn't happen particularly. What happened was government spending went through the roof, but I'm not going to talk about that. What about the longer term consequences of this? Well, what we have had this year is the biggest tax raising year other than 1993 in at least half a century. So the announcements in the budget, big increases in corporation tax, increases in income tax, and then the announcements a couple of weeks ago for the effectively an increase in national insurance, a new health and social care levy. Between them, if implemented, will raise about 1.6% of national income. Now, government, of course, did this under the cover of COVID. Most of it had nothing to do with COVID. Quite clever politically, I think. But certainly all of that money for health and social care raised a couple of weeks ago would have been needed irrespective of whether COVID had happened or not, had nothing whatever to do with COVID. And that, if you go back to my previous slide, which showed the increased debt over time, that was always, in my view, going to be necessary. And so what we've actually had is something that was going to have to happen during the 2020s has happened over the last year, or is planned to happen. These increases are not there yet. So I think one of the biggest long-term outcomes, actually, oddly, of the last year will be to put our fiscal situation on a more stable footing, because without the crisis, I think governments would have found it harder to implement these very big increases in taxes, which, as I say, I think are absolutely necessary if we are to maintain the welfare state at anything like what we have become used to. So that's the first takeaway, I think, in terms of, I talk about all sorts of outcomes of COVID, but being head of the IFS, I have to say something about fiscal stuff. So that's number one. Number two, I want to say a little bit about, which I don't think we talk about enough, is interest rates. And that's monetary rather than fiscal, but I'm going to talk about them anyway. So that high level of debt is associated with record low levels of interest payments by government because interest rates are so staggeringly low. This is a chart over the last 20 years, but if you go back all the way to when the Bank of England was founded in 1693, I think it was, you won't find interest rates this low at any point in more than 300 years. So this is interest rates on government bonds, but I could have shown you the bank base rate. It's a similar kind of picture, except that the bank base rate went down in 2010 and just stayed extremely low, close to zero. So this matters to government, but it also matters in pretty much every other walk of life. Anthony will probably know that the biggest hit to university finances in the last year has not been loss of students or overseas students or conference income. It's been the hit to the university superannuation scheme. And that arises largely because long-term interest rates are even lower now than they were 18 months ago. Why do we have no occupational pensions in the private sector? Because interest rates are so low that they can't be afforded. Why do we have no annuities anymore? Because interest rates are so low. Why are house prices so high? Because interest rates are so low. Why do we have the intergenerational problem where the old and the wealthy have done very well and the young and the unwealthy have done very badly? Because interest rates are low and have been going down for a substantial period of time. And at the moment, at least, COVID appears to have embedded those historically low rates of interest. And I think this matters incredibly politically as well as economically. I'm just going to show you a chart. I can show you all sorts of charts about collapsing home ownership. Home ownership among those in their 20s and 30s is about halved in the last 25 years after 50 years of gradual growth. This chart is showing you, it's taking people in them from their mid-20s to their mid-30s, and it's showing you what fraction of them are homeowners. At the moment, this is showing you in 1997. So you can see that, as you'd expect, on the lowest income groups, not very many homeowners. Among the highest income groups, very high rates of home ownership. What does it look like more recently? This is a couple of years out of date, 2017. You can see the collapse in home ownership among low and middle income groups in that age group. Why do I think this matters so much? Well, look at that middle group. 25 years ago, they looked very much like the rich in terms of being homeowners. Today, they look very much like the poor in terms of not being homeowners. And that's all about private renting. The other change, of course, is that there's very little social renting. So again, those on the lowest and middle incomes are all private renters. Essentially down to interest rates falling so much over this period, pushing up asset prices, in this case, house prices. And I think one of the worries of one of the things that certainly hasn't got better over the last year, though we'll wait to see what happens as a result of potentially increasing inflation, is that interest rates have, Bank of England base rates gone down even further, and interest rates on government debt and on pretty much everything else have gone even further down. So underlying a lot of, I think, the issues facing us in terms of inequality, particularly wealth inequality, are these very low interest rates. So I'm going to move on from that, but do bear that in mind, because in some ways I think that's probably the most important background economic fact of the last 20 or 25 years, has been that collapse in interest rates and the unintended but huge distributional consequences between, as I say, generations, and in particular those with and without wealth that's had. I'm now going to say something about incomes, and I'm just going to run through quickly where we were pre-pandemic to remind you, I said I'm not usually very chirpy, to remind you how bad things were before we even got to the pandemic. So median income over the last 20 years had grown somewhat. I mean, you'd expect it to, you'd hope it would be. Median income in 2020 was a bit higher than it was in 2002. But it hadn't gone up much in a decade. That's what it should have done, in the sense of, had household incomes risen by the same average rate that they had since 1950, between 1950 and 2008, they would have been about 20% higher than they in fact are. And if you look at wages only, then the story is even worse when it comes to their real level over that period. So we went into this crisis with very low, much lower levels of income than you'd expect. And a sort of second, as it were, or another extraordinary fact is that we're now in a world where significant fractions of people in their 20s and 30s are earning less than or no more than their parents. Now, that's not as big an issue yet in the UK as it is in the US, where a majority of people in their 30s are earning less than their parents were when they were in their 30s. But we are beginning to move in that direction, and polling suggests that we now have something like 3/4 of people of my sort of age who think that our children will be no better off than we were. Now, that again is a political as well as an economic worry. Actually, no great increase in inequality over this period. It was pretty poor income growth across the distribution. Absolute poverty, by which I mean sort of government definition of numbers below a certain fraction of income as it was in 1997, you normally expect that to be falling at a reasonable rate, because if incomes are rising at all at the bottom, then on this measuring absolute poverty falls. You can see it really didn't change much over the last 15 years or so, which is a pretty worrying statistic. But I want to focus a bit more on this. Who are the poor? Well, increasingly, they are in work. So the percentage of people of working age who are in the poorest group, just over a decade ago, nearly half of them were not working. Just before the pandemic, only a third of them were not working. So one very good thing happening here, much increased participation in the workforce. And one very bad thing, a lot of low levels of hours and low levels of earnings, which means that lots of people in work are nevertheless in poverty. Now, very interesting change in trend over the last 20 years. Over the 2000s, under the last Labour government, increases in welfare benefits essentially offset increasing inequality in the labour market. Over the last 5 years at least, increased participation in the labour market has offset reduced generosity of the welfare system. So over that whole period, actually, across most of the distribution, inequality hasn't changed very much. But in the first period, that was because of active increases in welfare benefits offsetting market inequalities. In the last several years, it's the other way around. Welfare benefits have increased, cuts in welfare benefits are increasing inequality, somewhat offset by increased hours and earnings. And again, one of the things that has defined certainly the last several months, and actually the whole of this crisis, has been the incredible strength of the labour market, which I'm going to say a bit more about now. And this is where my story, which I'm going to tell this evening, really is very different from the story that I would have told 6 or 9 months ago. So if you look at who was losing work in the height of lockdown, so this is changes between just pre-pandemic and the beginning of this year when we were in lockdown, you see this pattern. Who are the losers? Well, the ones I've bracketed in red there, those with low levels of qualification, so big increases in fractions of those who are not working. The young, those under 25, huge increase in the fraction of them not working, and see how small those increases are for older groups, and certain ethnic minorities, big increases in the fraction of them not working. Now, not in a sense surprising. I mean, this is what you might normally expect. The young, the poorly educated, those who are suffering multiple disadvantages were the ones who were losing jobs, and that that boded ill, I think, for the recovery. But if you look, and this only goes to June, you get a very different picture. Actually, the young are the most likely to have access to this is a measure of essentially of vacancies relative to the number of people out of work. The young got lots of vacancies to go to. Actually, the labour market has been stronger for those with low levels of qualifications, and I'll show some more evidence of that in a minute. We're actually publishing, sadly, I can't show the best data on this because we're publishing something on Thursday, which you should look out for, which I can assure you strengthens the points that I'm going to make, but I'm having to use slightly old data so I don't break our own embargo. But the story is the same. The recovery in the labour market has been much stronger for the low educated and much stronger for the young than it has been for the high educated and the old. So this chart is showing you a measure of vacancies. And you can see that for the lowest paid occupations, the green line, vacancies are already 20% above pre-pandemic levels, whereas for the higher paid groups, they're essentially the same as pre-pandemic levels. So what we've got is a labour market which is going in very different directions for different parts of the population, and somewhat unusually actually recovering particularly strongly for those in low-paid occupations. And you can see that in a lot of the headlines that we've got. Interestingly, we could see in this vacancy data very early on the HGV problem. You could see it in June, absolutely plain as day. Interesting questions as to why government didn't spot that. So recovery in the labour market more for lower educated. The other thing I think is very striking here is if you look in terms of change in employment rates across age groups, yes, you do certainly through to the second quarter of this year, you still see an issue for younger workers, but you really see a big issue for older workers here, which is something that I think has had relatively little attention. And again, without giving too much away, more up-to-date analysis shows that this pattern is even stronger than it appears here. For the younger workers, this issue is going away. For the older workers, it isn't. And a lot of this is about moving into inactivity and retirement. So we've lost a chunk of the labour force, which we would not otherwise have lost as a result of the pandemic. I don't think I've got the other chart that I wanted to show you indicating that, but that's essentially about losing a lot of a significant number of people in their 50s and early 60s to early retirement to inactivity, and whether they will come back into the labour force, we don't know. And that's a long run cost, partly because these are choices being made that would not otherwise have been made, and obviously a fiscal cost as well. And we also know on the whole that continuing to work is good for the health of many older people. A third thing, which I don't think has had anywhere near enough attention, which region has suffered most economically? London, London, London. On any measure you look at, London has suffered most economically over the last 18 months, 2 years, particularly when you look at the labour market. So very big fall in the number of people enrolled, payroll. You also see bigger increases in unemployment, smaller increases in vacancies. Any measure you look at, London has had the most difficult pandemic from a labour market and economic point of view. So, we may not get levelling up, but it does look like we're getting a bit of levelling down. That's a bit, the point about London and what's going on here is the point that people continually forget is that London has a huge low-paid labour market. There is just as much poverty in London as there is anywhere else in the country. It's just London is also where all the rich people are. And we need to remember that. And I'm going to say a little bit about geography. Really need to remember that when we talk about levelling up. And this is just to sort of illustrate something that just astonishes me. Look at people who are made redundant. Just look at the within 6 months one here, the one on the right. The green bar is of those people who were made redundant in the financial crisis back in 2007 to 2010. What fraction of them were back in work within 6 months? Well, the answer is about 50%. During the COVID crisis, it was higher than that. I find that the resilience of the labour market in that people are finding easier to move from unemployment to work during this last period than they were during the financial crisis, I find absolutely extraordinary. And remember, unemployment rate today is barely above where it was 3 or 4 years ago. And again, the labour market has been staggeringly resilient. And we're seeing that it's too resilient in the sense that there are some areas with lots of vacancies. I want to say something very briefly about the self-employed. I think something that's really struck me from the analysis that we've done and the impact of the furlough scheme is that the self-employed were not supported well by the furlough scheme. Some were massively over-supported, some were massively under-supported. We don't have a welfare state which is well set for what is now a big fraction of the workforce. And this is showing you that there's been a much bigger increase in the fraction of self-employed who are not working than there has been in the fraction of people who were employees who are not working. A 50% bigger increase in the fraction of self-employed not working. And as I say, a welfare state really not well suited to them. So another challenge, I think, post-COVID that COVID really ought to make us think much harder about is how we design a welfare state that works for the self-employed. So just to summarize where I think we are with the labour market, unemployment's gone up staggeringly little, and Bank of England projections are to be believed won't go up much even after furlough ends on Friday this week. Redundant workers have found work more quickly than they did during the financial crisis, even during lockdown. Earnings growth has actually been similar to what it was pre-pandemic. Who's been hit hardest, actually? It's not the ones you might think. It's older workers, Londoners and graduates who have been hit hard. Very unusual and I don't know how long that's going to last, but it's a different story to the one I would have told 6 or 9 months ago. Now let me say something brief about another key issue in inequalities, which is education. You are, I'm sure, perfectly familiar with this kind of chart. This is showing you the fraction of 26-year-olds in 2016 as it happens, but it would look very, very similar if I had slightly more up-to-date data here. So by the time they're 26, about a third have got a degree, about a fifth have got vocational qualifications at sort of level 3 or there. Let me go the other way around. A third have got only GCSEs or less. About a fifth have got a vocational qualification. A small fraction, the yellow bit, have got A levels only. A tiny fraction have got vocational qualifications above A level, and then a third have got a university degree. So you can see there's this huge bifurcation. You've got a degree, or you've got GCSEs or below, with some having middle to low level vocational qualifications. Look at the most deprived fifth. You've got half of them only having GCSEs or level or below, 17% at university with university degrees, and then the best of, on the far right, you've got private school students, 70% with degrees, way higher even than the most affluent of those in the state system. So you've got huge inequalities according to parental background pre-pandemic. Now, this is an area where I think there is, and this is just showing basically nothing is changing very much over quite a long period. I won't explain that particular chart. This is something where I am feeling quite miserable. This has almost certainly got worse through the pandemic. So this is showing you the fraction of the weekly hours of the richest and poorest 20%. On the left, primary school children; on the right, secondary school children. This is based on a survey carried out by my colleagues at the IFS. And what that's showing you is that, as you might expect, while pre-pandemic, poorer and richer kids were, at least in principle, spending the same amount of hours working. But during certainly the first part of the pandemic, poorer children were spending significantly less time learning than children from richer backgrounds. Now, the positive story is that gap closed. There's a big change between the first and second lockdowns, as there was on things like access to remote learning and so on. But the bad news, as you might expect, is that kids from schools with poorer schools, so look at the secondary schools there, you've got significantly more attainment loss relative to what you might expect from kids in schools with lots of poorer children, high free school meals, than with those in low free school meals. The absolute numbers are quite bad. I mean, to lose 1.5 or 2 months of learning is quite a lot. But what worries me more is that this exacerbation of educational inequalities. What's very striking is also there's a real geographical gradient here. London did better than other regions. For reasons that aren't entirely clear to me, Yorkshire in particular, there's bigger losses, and this is for primary school reading, but you see a similar pattern across secondary and primary school maths and reading. So of all of the things that I'm talking about, I think this may be the increase in inequality where we see the longest term and most negative consequences. As I say, for a lot of what I'm talking about, I think we are broadly moving back to where we were, but I worry that may not be the case in education. I've already mentioned geography with respect to what's happening in the London labour market relative to elsewhere. So this is a horrible, horrible chart, but what this is just telling you that geographical inequality is incredibly complicated. So don't try and look at all of the lovely colours and so on. What this is essentially saying is that it depends how you so people often talk about the thing on the far left, gross value added per person. We look incredibly unequal on that. You've got London wildly above every other region. What they don't often tell you about is the one second from the right, which is actually looking at actual median incomes after you take account of housing costs, in which case we don't look very unequal at all, and London's bang in the middle. So actual living standards among actual Londoners, once you take out actual housing costs at the median, are no higher than they are in the rest of the country. The thing that I said earlier that distinguishes London from the rest of the country is it's where all the rich people are, and that's increasingly true. Poverty is everywhere, richness is not, and that's actually really what distinguishes the different regions. I won't go through local authority spending other than to say local authority grants have been cut more for poorer local authorities. One of the things that we at the IFS, my colleagues, you see here, Jack Britton, Laura van der Erve, Ben Walkman and Zhao Weizhu have been looking at is what happens to geographical mobility among graduates. Important to think about them occasionally at an institution like this. What's this showing you? Well, this is showing you along the bottom, it's the share of graduates among 27-year-olds from that area. So that's telling you that only fewer than 20% of young people from Wisbech and Grimsby become graduates. But along the y-axis, you're seeing what fraction of people actually living in Grimsby and Wisbech at that age are graduates, which is even smaller. So what's telling you is that a lot of these areas with the poorer areas, the coastal areas, the left behind areas, first, they don't produce many graduates, and second, the graduates they do produce move elsewhere. And where do they go? Well, they go to London, a great big circle up the top, and places like Brighton and Leeds and Bristol and some of the cities. So most places actually lose graduates. Anything below the 45-degree line, they're places that are losing graduates, and they lose large numbers to London and some of those other cities. The ones to worry about, and we haven't done this, but I bet you there's a very strong correlation between the ones losing graduates and things like voting for Brexit. But the areas that are often thought of as left behind are in that bottom left bit. They're not producing many graduates, and the ones they do produce are moving away. So if we're looking at leveling up, this is out of thought a very, very first place to look. I have to produce a map. There's a lovely map showing the big red areas where the graduates move to and the blue areas where they move away from. Final set of things I want to say something briefly about, because it's, again, something's become very evident for all sorts of reasons over the last 18 months, is differences by ethnicity. And we're hoping over the next few years to do a lot more work on this at the IFS. And I should say, we're doing a lot of work on inequalities at the moment under the aegis of the Deaton Review. So Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate, is leading a big piece of work with us on inequalities. And we've got a book-length report on ethnicity coming out relatively soon. But some of these numbers during the pandemic are really striking. So this is the fraction of men and women from different ethnic minorities working in the health and care sector relative to white British. So what that's showing you is that Black African men are 4 times as likely as white men to be working in the health and care sector. Indian men 2.5 times as likely. Black African women 2.5 times as likely. We're remarkably dependent on some of these groups in our health and care sectors. They've also, as a result, been at greater risk, as I'll show you in a minute. I talked about self-employment earlier. A lot of our ethnic minorities are much more likely to be self-employed than the white majority. And again, if we have a welfare state that doesn't support the self-employed terribly well, then inadvertently we're not supporting some ethnic minorities terribly well. Then we've got these big differences in ethnic death rates relative to white British. This is ONS data. This is from the second wave, and you can see this extraordinary Bangladeshi men and women 4 times as likely, once you adjust for age, to die of COVID as white men and women. Actually, in the first wave, the same was true of black Africans. Now, the blue bits here are once you adjust for things like poverty and how and living conditions and so on. The fact that the blue is so much below the green is telling you there's a lot of poverty and poor living conditions among these ethnic groups as well. I won't say anything about climate change because I've said far too much, and I promised to keep to time, which I think I have remarkably broadly done. So let me just provide some concluding thoughts. I think my main concluding thought is the one that I started with. I've run through an awful lot of stuff. I think, broadly speaking, whether you're thinking about the public finances or you're thinking about inequalities, the challenges aren't, this has not changed. COVID has been extraordinary for the last 18 months, but about the things I've talked about, that hasn't changed the world. We've still got tight public finances. We've still got huge challenges in the spending review, which we're going to see in the next few weeks. But the government, under cover of COVID, has done some pretty swift fiscal maneuvering in imposing, or saying they're going to impose, some pretty whacking tax increases on us over the next few years. I think the interest rate challenge, the intergenerational challenge, the asset challenge has thus far, if anything, become even greater. As I say, what happens with interest rates and inflation, we don't know. Most inequalities are as before. Some are in sharper focus. I've mentioned very quickly, very briefly, ethnic differences, and we've got a report on our website which goes into a lot more detail on ethnic differences over the pandemic. As I say, a lot more to come. I think very strikingly for me, as I say, big increases in the number of self-employed over the last 20 years, but a complete failure of the state actually to support the self-employed in an effective way over the last 18 months. And I think real challenges, which we've all seen with Uber and all those sorts of things, to provide a tax and welfare system that works for the self-employed. And then some different and additional challenges, the biggest of which I think is this potential widening of the education divide, which could really come back and bite us. And it's particularly, I don't have the data, but certainly lots of anecdote, that some of the most deprived and the most difficult to teach have become even harder to engage in the last year. And then, the labour market, very different story to the one I might have expected. At the moment, it looks like older workers, actually better educated workers and London workers who face the biggest challenges. But of course, we all face challenges where there are large numbers of vacancies, and I haven't gone down that route. I'm happy to answer on any of this or more broadly in questions, but thank you very much.
So please join me here. Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for what was really a tour de force, and you are absolutely right. You've got through those slides at a clip, but with clarity. So that's greatly appreciated. Now, this Mentimeter tool is fantastic for a chair because apparently I get to decide whether the question is answered or not by clicking on it. So I can hold you to a standard. And the first question was my question too, of course. So I'll read it. Thanks for a great presentation. How much do the challenges you outlined labour market shortages?
Well, clearly the labour market shortages that we face are exacerbated by Brexit. Brexit. We know that. We know that large numbers of migrant workers returned to Europe and haven't come back. Now, in a sense, unfortunately for us, it's pretty clear that COVID and Brexit interacted in a particularly unhelpful way. Fortunately, you could argue for government, and again, COVID can be used as an excuse and cover for problems that may have become apparent at some point. I mean, I think there is a deeper and I think reasonable challenge to that, which is we have become absurdly dependent on skilled workforce, which we have not trained, whether that remains the case actually in the National Health Service, where we continue to be dependent on importing huge numbers of staff. That's clearly true, as it turns out, in HGV, driving, and others. We then also, I think, have a genuine choice. If we can't grow strawberries in a way which allows us to pay and provide conditions for British-born workers that they're willing to accept, well, we have a choice. I mean, either we say, well, actually growing strawberries is better done somewhere else, or we mechanize or find some other way of doing it, or we continue to rely on immigrant workers. I think that's a genuine political and social question as much as it is an economic one. But all of this provides us with challenges, and I mean, just to sort of slightly self-reflective for a while, although it's not work that we've done. If you look at a lot of economic work over the last 10, 15 years, it will tell you fairly, clearly that there wasn't any evidence that very big increases in immigration had a negative effect on wages. And I worry about that work because that was based on broadly sort of marginal changes, comparing one area of the UK with another. What it wasn't able to do was, I think, look at the fact that actually the structure of the economy is just different. You've got 3 million additional people who have come in to the country. Then you've just got a different economy. The economy you would have had if those 3 million people hadn't come in. And to the extent that we're getting a dramatic reversal in that, I don't know quite how dramatic it is. We're certainly not getting the growth. Then again, our economy will change shape, and economies that change shape can be quite disruptive for a period of time. Economies change shape all the time, gradually, but when you've got big, quick changes in the shape of the economy, then then making the transition, as we're seeing at the moment, can be really quite painful.
I mean, politically, I guess it would be very instructive to be able to unpick some of this. Do you have an idea about how one might go about doing that? I mean, you said, one thing masks the other, and it's quite difficult to tell. But do you have an idea about?
Well, I think they genuinely interact in that, were it not for both of them, Brexit alone might not have left people moving back to their home countries. COVID alone might not have done, but the two of them together might have done. But I think the obvious way to unpick it is to compare ourselves with other countries in Europe who still are in the European Union. And as has been pointed out, they're not facing all of the same problems that we are, which does indicate that there is a significant role for Brexit.
So thank you very much. That was very interesting, and thank you, Rory, for a great question. So the next question: where should the Chancellor focus his attention in the spending review to address the challenges and inequalities you outlined? Brackets, other than obviously 2.4% for science.
At least. So, it's been a slightly odd few months in the sense we had a big chunk of the spending review 3 weeks ago when Chancellor found a large amount of money for health and possibly some for social care with this big tax increase that I indicated. Now that does make his life a little bit easier for the rest of the spending review, because he's kind of taken this big behemoth, which is the health service, and put it to one side and found some money for it, at least for the next 3 or 4 years, although he's not it will come back for more, because it always does. Beyond that, as I think should be evident from what I was saying, education, and particularly schools, are clearly a priority, partly because spending per pupil in schools is still below where it was in 2010, and it's more below where it was in 2010 in poorer schools than it is in richer schools. There's always issues here about making sure that money is spent well in an effective way, but certainly schools would be pretty high up my priority list. And then there are the bits of the system, and then local government is another, where there's almost certainly not enough in the where we are for the social care promises that be made. Of course, social care is by far the biggest thing that local government does, and other parts of local government have struggled. And then the other, I think, much neglected part of public spending, which we know is in a terrible state, is the justice system, where I would, if I were the Chancellor, be focusing some resource. So the problem he faces is that there are a lot of priorities there, and a number of those areas have struggled for a considerable period of time.
Thank you. And of course, a powerful political voice there in justice, so it might have an interesting effect. So, reflecting on the charts showing graduate losses and gains by region, what challenges does this pose for the levelling up agenda?
I think those charts are, I mean, I showed them because I do think they're incredibly interesting and important. So, we have got significant towns and parts of the country where, as it were, they're not producing very many young people who are going on to great things, and those who are leave. And there's sort of not our work, but other work which suggests that this leaves those communities feeling somewhat denuded, and, to use the awful term, left behind. So I had another chart which I took out at the last minute, which also showed that where there are towns with universities, they hold on to more, but nearly all of the graduates, I exaggerate, the large fraction of the graduates from Sunderland go to university in Sunderland. So they're born in Sunderland, go to university in Sunderland, they stay. Whereas if there hadn't been a university there, they would have more have moved away and never come back. So actually having educational institutions in some of these places probably can help. But the issue here is a sort of one of these horrible equilibria, where what's going to attract you to stay in, say, Grimsby, or move to Grimsby? Well, it's in good, high skilled jobs, well paid, and a sense of a good place to be. What's going to attract the jobs? Well, it's the graduates. And truth is, I don't think we've got a very good answer to how you break out of these spirals, which areas get into. One thing I would say to the government is they need to decide what they're going to focus on, because they're not going to level up everywhere at the same time. But one gets the sense that they're focusing on everything. I think they need to, I don't know what the right answer is, but they need to decide a pretty small number of priorities and try and make those work, rather than think they can do everything in the next 3 years, because they really can't.
And fascinating how that picture complements data which I don't know whether yet has been released by HEPI and others on the economic effects of universities in their regions. I think there's a really nice bit of bringing those two bits of data together. So I think that's not a question, but just a note of approbation, which says good answer on spending review priorities, education, education, education. So with that, What I will just do is check whether there are any questions in the room. There are. Yes.
So there's a lot of press reports now about higher prices, and there's usually a microeconomic explanation, bottlenecks and things like that. But I wonder if there should be more thought about the macroeconomic explanation. The idea of fiscal theory of price, as a contrast to arithmetic. In other words, this is being driven by the deficits, and you don't see very much discussion of that. And I also have sort of a side question, which is that the median wage in this country is about 14 pounds, and the mean wage is about 15. And as I understand, as of today, possibly, we're all going to be above average. What will be the implications of that?
Do you want to just summarize your understanding of the question? Because, of course, not everybody can hear out in digital land.
So there were two questions there. One was what's driving inflation? Is it just bottlenecks, or is it also supply constraints, or is it also fiscal and monetary environment? The second question, I think, referring to the Labour Party voting for a £15 an hour minimum wage, which is above the current median. What might the effects of that be? Well, I mean, on the second question, I don't want to be rude, but it's quite hard to take seriously the idea of a minimum wage which is above the current median. It's clearly not feasible. You know, I think economists and others have been too slow and conservative with minimum wage policy over a period of time, and you know, it's got up to about £8.60 an hour, I think, now, which is about getting on for 2/3 or 60% of the median. It's aiming for £10. I think we should get there, see how that works, maybe take some additional steps. But I don't think any country in the world ever has decided to introduce a minimum at its current, or indeed above, as you suggest, its current median. You know, I don't think, I mean, as I understand it, it's not Labour Party policy. On the inflation question, you know, I should say very clearly, I'm, you know, this is for fiscal studies, not monetary studies, and I'm not an expert on this. That said, you know, we've got two things. I mean, as you suggest, we've got two things going on. We've got some specific supply constraint issues. Everything from, you know, lack of microchips to lack of HGV drivers to lack of glass to, you know, all sorts of things which are driving up prices, in some ways not driving up prices as fast as you might think. And then this incredibly loose monetary and fiscal policy. You know, with almost £1 trillion of quantitative easing in the system at the moment, and base rate at 0.1, you know, there are, I mean, I think there are risks being driven both on both sides. And it is, as I say, as a non-expert, it is surprising to me that the bank hasn't yet taken any action on that.
When looking at regional inequalities, you showed London as suffering. The other area that stood out a bit is Scotland. Just wonder what's going on there.
So again, if you could repeat the question.
The question was why also is Scotland looking bad when you look at the impacts on the labour market? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, that was looking at. So let me tell you about my holiday. That was looking at payrolled employees, and clearly they're struggling to recruit some in the north of Scotland where I went on holiday, because it's quite hard to get a meal. So it may be something to do with Brexit. I don't think it is. I don't know the answer to that question specifically, I have to say.
Right. Well, thank you very much indeed for really an outstanding presentation. An honour to the social scientist in whose name this memorial lecture is given, and if the audience could show their appreciation, that's great.